Yeah, and I think that that leads very well into this next bit. There's an understanding, and I would say it's probably a very American understanding, though I'm sure it also exists in the United Kingdom as well. Understanding of socialism, where it's like when the government does more, it's more socialist, and when it does it less, it's it's more capitalist, right? And like in its extremes, obviously that argument can appear is very silly, but I oftentimes see socialists, especially in the United States, probably because they're so used to having to push back against that idea, is falsely equivalating, more government activity with socialism. And I wanted to quote from your book on the Corona crash, where he says, we cannot fall into the trap outlined by Lenin of believing that a quantitative increase in state activity somehow affects a qualitative shift from capitalism to socialism. Instead, we must concern ourselves with how state power is being used and who is wielding it.
Yeah.
Could you
I
expand on
wanted
that a
to
little? Yeah.
find that. I was just trying to
Oh,
find that quote from Lenin that I began that at the beginning.
oh man, I'm sorry I didn't
Um,
have.
no, it's okay. Oh, it doesn't matter. It's a really good quote though. Maybe I don't know. I'll find it and put it in the description or
No,
something.
you definitely should. I
Um,
mean, Lennon's one of those writers who, like, if you ever need to, get a little
yeah, something
cheeks.
really spicy.
Yeah.
He loved that. Just peppering his enemies with these amazing quotes. No, I can't find it, but it is a really good quote. And yeah, I'm basically saying that it's very easy to confuse what is effectively state capitalism with socialism. Um, and yeah, this is something that we do all the time, basically, because I mean, it's basically a reflection of the weakness of the power of the left, right? The people who would usually be arguing, oh, we need a bigger, more compassionate, nicer state would be liberals and social democrats. They would be the ones
Mhm.
who would be saying, the market needs to be constrained because we have, these ideas about what it means to be kind of ethical socialist, right? So their whole framework isn't really about class struggle. It's about, making capitalism nicer, basically,
Mhm.
which is, obviously at certain periods in history and in certain places possible because there was an element of that in the kind of Keynesian settlement in the global north. It was obviously relying upon hyper exploitation in other parts of the world. But that was possible. It was, the fact that socialists are now the ones that are saying, oh, no, we all need to rely on the state. All you have to do is go back to Marx, who said it was a committee
Mhm.
for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie.
Mhm.
Now, it's a bit of an oversimplification because, Marxist state theorists have moved beyond that quite substantially and, seeing the state as actually an entity that does have some agency and is reflected by all these wider struggles that are taking place in society as a whole. I've mentioned some already. So Polancis is great on
Mhm.
this. Ralph Miliband is also really good. Gramsci obviously writes quite a bit about the state, and that's well worth reading, especially when you're thinking about political strategy. Um, so yeah, I mean, the fact that we've ended up in this position, given the clear lineage of Marxists and socialists being very, very critical of capitalist states, where we basically just think, oh well, if the state spends more money, then we're all fine. It's very worrying, and it's been particularly, the weaknesses of that approach weren't so obvious when we were, especially in the UK, fighting against things like austerity, right?
Mhm.
Which,
Mhm.
was an attempt to, it was class war from above, really. It was an attempt to render the conditions of life more unstable for those at the bottom, basically kind of reduce their power relative to capital during a time of weakness for the latter. But because we didn't really get that point, we didn't say austerity is about class struggle. We just said, oh, austerity is bad because it means less state spending. When the state started to spend more during the pandemic, everyone was like, oh, great, we have socialism now. Boris
Mhm.
Johnson's become a socialist. Corbyn won the argument. I was like, no, that's not what's happening. The needs of capital have shifted. And
Mhm.
so, people who largely, undertake policy in order to support the interests of capital have shifted what they're doing as well. Um, so yeah, I mean, this is why it's really important to kind of hit that particular nail at this point, because otherwise, basically, the left ends up looking like a kind of boring, paternalistic, like nanny-ish like group of people who are just like, you don't know what's best for you, so we're going to
Mhm.
get the state to do it for you. And it's like, actually, that's contrary to everything that socialists have been fighting for, which is giving power to people.
Exactly, and I mean, I love that last point, especially because, um, you know, I've interviewed some really great like labor organizers in Texas, who do work with the AFL-CIO,
Yeah.
and they were able to fundamentally change the conversation within the union there about things like the Green New Deal.
Mm.
And you have to understand, if you're doing union work in Texas, that means you're doing union work with people who
Yeah,
directly work
oil
or are
country. Yeah.
affected with, oil
I
and
think I
gas.
saw a really cool video by
Yeah,
someone in
Ryan
the campaign
Pollock.
who,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mike Siegel in Texas,
Mm,
who unfortunately didn't win. Pollock did a really great video, and it was his story is a really great lesson, organizing lesson,
mm,
for the left. And like, there's some aspects of it that, the cultural stuff. So like basically when he put this forward, drop all the talk about AOC, or even ended up even dropping the term Green New Deal, and it's like call it
mm.
federal environmental policy, right? And you do that because people are functionally like inoculated to hear
Yeah,
that argument. But what really was the shift for people is when he said, "Do you think that these jobs are going to be able to provide for you 5 years in the future?" And people are like,
yeah,
do you think that we need to have a just transition where you
mm,
are in a leadership role, not just that we're going to provide you
yeah,
with money, we're going to give you a leadership role? That's the kind of shift that we really need the left to get behind, because especially with things like the Green New Deal. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because I know that's something that you advocate for a lot. Like there are potentials of like a kind of like right-wing neoliberal
yeah,
version of like, environmental policy, right?
mm,
Where you just put very regressive tax on poor people,
yeah,
you decimate entire industries, right? So you have to understand that, again, just because the state's doing more doesn't make it socialist or
yeah,
pro-worker. In fact, like we need to be asking the questions: who is it wielding power for, and to what ends?
yeah. I think that is an important point, because I often say there's no solution to the climate crisis within capitalism. What I really
Mhm.
need to say is there's no solution to the climate crisis within capitalism, parentheses, that doesn't involve basically consigning a large portion of the world's population to dying, which is one way to solve the climate crisis,
Mhm.
is to say we're going to leave all the regions of the world that will be affected by rising sea levels, desertification, extreme weather events, basically to suffer their own fate, put up really strong and well fortified borders, and protect the centres of capital accumulation in the global north, and basically say fuck you to the global south, and indeed to poorer people in the global south as well, who will be affected by, whether it's in California, wildfires, or air pollution, or all the other extreme weather events that
Mhm.
will end up hitting various parts of the global north. So there is a kind of a bunker mentality way of dealing with climate breakdown, which I'm sure many sections of the global elite are planning for, really,
Mhm.
already. So yeah, there is a solution to climate breakdown within capitalism, but it just involves basically kind of mass social murder. Um, the only real way to, I suppose, mitigate the climate breakdown that's already with us, because in many ways we're beyond the point of prevention for many parts of the world now. Um, as you say, to create a just transition, and do this in a fair way, as well as obviously, reducing our emissions to try and make the problem less bad,
Mhm.
is through some sort of Green New Deal that involves, you know, that is about, really, the center of, I think, the Green New Deal should really be about, I suppose, deepening class struggle rather than attempting to ameliorate it by placing the interests and voices of working people, the ones who are most likely to be affected by this thing, at the forefront of the demands that are being made.
Mhm.
And yes, those demands might be being made of the state, but the crucial thing to think about is how those demands are being articulated, and what is the process by which we think we're going to win these things. Do we just think we'll elect good politicians and they'll do it for us, or do we think we need to organize?
Mhm.
I think that's the critical thing. When we think about how we articulate this thing, it's not just like something that those guys can do on our behalf, which is where I think comparisons with the New Deal, although obviously the New Deal was like, the foundations of that was,
Mhm.
a much more powerful labor movement.
Mhm.
So there is that. The other thing, of course, is that this is only going to work if it happens at the level of the global economy. And that's in many ways the pipe dream, but there are a lot of things that rich countries could do to support efforts at climate mitigation and decarbonisation in the global south. And that stems everything from kind of technology transfers, which is really, really, really important,
Yes.
which obviously kind of intellectual property law gets massively in the way of, to just, resource transfers, to thinking about kind of new financing mechanisms for climate mitigation. So like a new kind of global climate bank that was able to lend to the global south would be a really big thing. A debt write-off for the global south is going to be very, very important, because we've seen the biggest
Mhm.
capital outflow from the poor countries on this planet ever during the COVID crisis. So, lots of those countries basically struggling to both provide for their citizens and repay their creditors. So yeah, this kind of has to be conceptualized in a much bigger way that is looking at the capitalist world system
Hmm.
and is looking at the positions of different classes and different groups within that, rather than just saying, oh, well, the American state is the world's foremost imperial power, so we can create as much money as we want and use it to do whatever we want. And we'll do the Green New Deal by making the military bigger so we can keep out all the migrants that are going to be pushed out
Hmm.
of like desertified regions, which is something that they're thinking about already. So yeah, I mean, this is the Green New Deal is a very broad and
Yeah.
big moniker, and that's partly what makes it so powerful, but it's also obviously a big part of the problem.
Well, again, it can be a huge opportunity and also, can go horribly wrong, like anything in politics.
Yeah.
Um, I wanted to talk about this because you were just mentioning about what's been happening in the global south, because I know this is something that you're passionate about, something that I've been very passionate about as well, which has been this outflow of capital from that part of the world. And I want to bring up a specific example that I've been talking about since the beginning of this COVID crisis, which was what was happening in Argentina, where at the beginning of the crisis, you're having the minister of economy spending his time not trying to deal with and help out the people of the country, but literally negotiating with primarily American and
Yeah.
European bondholders, primarily represented by BlackRock,
Yeah.
who wanted, one, money, and two, a say in the way that a country was managed. And there's the whole story about how those negotiations went and all that, which I think we can just put to the side for now, because the fundamental point that I've always tried to make to my audience was that you need to understand this as a struggle for democracy, right?
Mm.
Where a government wins an election
Yeah.
and they face a challenge, which is, how do we make sure that people don't die from this horrible virus? And instead of being able to deal with that, they have a bunch of people who aren't citizens of their country demanding that they take certain economic policy, which is, again, is a great example of how capital very much is incompatible with, the concept of democracy. I'd love to hear your thoughts, on that analysis. And then also, one thing that I know, you outlined very well, and it's just an interesting development that we've seen within capitalism is, the term like capital controls, right? And how that is
Mm.
just such something that we can't touch. It's very, especially in like a lot of like mainstream economists, it's like that's the worst policy that you could ever do. And what we're seeing again in Argentina is they implemented a solidarity tax on millionaires, and what we've seen in response has been capital flight to the United States and
Yeah.
Uruguay. Um,
Yeah. So I think I'll start on the last point about capital
mhm,
controls. This is an interesting subject at the moment because there is a kind of growing consensus at the level of the global economy that capital controls can sometimes be useful. And this
mhm,
has become particularly obvious in the wake of the financial crisis. Um, and a big part of it comes down to really the way that you need to understand what's going on when central banks in the global north buy lots of assets and have interest rates really low, because what they're really doing is kind of squeezing returns, encouraging investors to go and seek out high yield, therefore risky investments, and in doing so they squeeze capital out of the global north and into the global south. So you get big capital inflows into the global south. A lot of that goes into government debt, and investors, when they're doing this, they know that they're taking a risk, but
mhm,
they also know that they'll probably be bailed out because their government will put pressure on the companies that the countries that they're lending to repay them back no matter what.
mhm,
And yeah, I mean, that is a whole other thing there. You've got actual moral hazard from the creditors themselves. They're the ones that are taking the risk in lending to these
mhm,
countries, and yet every time something goes wrong, they expect to be bailed out. You see this kind of, the deepest example of this with these entities called vulture funds, which basically buy up the debt of countries who look like they're about to default, so they can take them to court, sue them, and get tons of money. This happened with Zambia after the financial crisis, and a bunch of other countries as well. And it really is, an obviously abhorrent side of capitalism, but it reflects those kind of deeper structural issues. The issue with that, I think the reason that there's been a bit of a softening on capital controls is because they're becoming much easier to evade.
mhm,
Why? Partly because of things like Bitcoin.
mhm,
So if you're in kind of uh, Venezuela or certain parts of the world which do have restrictions, including Argentina, on your capacity to move currency, you can do it through Bitcoin. You can buy drugs through Bitcoin. You can
mhm,
move money through Bitcoin. So, and obviously, all those other uh, currencies based on distributed ledger technologies. And, various other technologies that are also making this easier. I mean, like financial secrecy, for example, is another factor that makes it a lot easier to move money around the world. So it's kind of like, yes, there's been a softening, but actually it's become much easier to evade, for the rich anyway. For kind of ordinary people, it's slightly more difficult. So yeah, that's a kind of inevitability that emerges from the growth of the world market that inevitably takes place under capitalism. But it is very important to remember that, especially when we're thinking about these things like lending, this is not inevitable. It is driven by a legal and regulatory architecture that is constructed by states, and predominantly by the most powerful states. So, it's not just that there are, I mean, firstly, there's very little actual, regulation that's been agreed by all kinds of states, debtors and creditors at the level of the global economy as to what happens when a country defaults. That's a problem, because it means that the most powerful countries are basically able to kind of exercise their will quite freely. But on a whole number of other issues, there is kind of international law on what governments can and can't do. Things like, for example, investor-state dispute settlements that are basically prevent governments from implementing certain policies that harm the interests of investors. Investors are able to take states to court in international arbitration courts, and often that means governments paying huge fines to tobacco companies, oil companies, whatever, when they've tried to regulate them properly. So there is a big architecture that exists at the level of the global economy, which extends beyond capital controls and really kind of deepens the power of capital in the global north over states and workers, and actually capital in the global south. So it's that entire architecture that is really what is constraining democracy. Capital flight has always been like centered in that analysis, because it was actually something that people thought they could control. There was capital flight and capital strike. You undermine the threat of capital strike by boosting public investment, which is actually, interestingly, how an analysis of the kind of relative strength of the state can come into this Marxist analysis. If you are actually undermining the power of capital to, I'd say, capital strike, then that is something that is reflecting the balance of class power. Capital strike, again, will just leave if you don't do X, and Y, and Z. And increasingly, actually, they don't even have to threaten that, because there is this system of rules and regulation that exists within international institutions and in kind of bilateral treaties between states that actually just prevents governments from doing certain things. And that is a real challenge primarily to states in the global south, because the punishment, I suppose, for breaking these things is something that can be dished out obviously most effectively by wealthier states and wealthier kind of groups of states. And the impact of that is going to be bigger on a smaller and poorer country. So places like, for example, Ecuador, right, which has tried to kind of push back against this quite a lot with previous governments and ended up being kind of punished as a result. You see this quite frequently. So yeah, I think there's like I've explained the problem very, very well in terms of actually, think about how we deal with this stuff. I mean, in many ways, the whole debate about Brexit was linked to this stuff. It was like, okay, right, so we're freeing ourselves from a lot of these EU laws and regulations that, systematically promote the interests of capital over labor, but we are not ending up with a progressive alternative. Instead, we're ending up with a conservative government that wants to slash workers' rights, remove environmental regulation, and make a trade deal with America that's going to include things like investor-state dispute settlements, along with a whole other set of things that, like privatization of the NHS, all that sort of stuff. So it's not clear in this particular historical juncture how we would rebuild the international system. But that's in many ways a secondary question, which comes after how do we deal with the state, and particularly imperial states like the US, which have the power to actually shape these rules much more profoundly than many others.
Yeah, and it's something that, I obviously don't have any answers to, and I think a lot of us are trying to work through them, but it's important for leftists, especially people who are living in the US and the UK, to understand those dynamics when you're talking about countries like Ecuador and
Mhm.
Argentina, as they try to build some kind of alternative to understand that the United States and the UK, I mean UK and Venezuela right
Yeah,
now, they
yeah,
play a massive role in
yeah.
preventing those countries from being able to implement even what they want to, and just understanding that we're very much all connected. It's a global working class struggle. Um, Grace, really thank you so much for joining me today. Please, everybody, check out her writing in Tribune Magazine. Really, her podcast, A World to Win, is phenomenal. Also, check that out too. And buy, Corona Crash and Stolen. They're both phenomenal books and have taught me a lot. Thanks again,
Thanks
Grace.
so much, David. It's been great to come on the show. Thanks for having me.